Hello, I wanted to spend a little time with you telling you about costumes and sewing today. And where I really wanted to start the conversation is really to do with what happens in the reading that you had. And one of the things that they talk about is comparing costumes to regular clothes. And one of the huge differences is that my daily wear here, I put on and I wear every now and then, and the occasional wash, how often do you do your laundry? But with clothes for the stage, actors are moving a lot, it's worn, it gets a lot more stress, so they need to be built much more strongly, and they're washed more often. If you think about those 2 show days, they probably wash clothes in between. And how often do you perform? 6 days a week. So you really want to make those garments that you're creating for the stage very strong. So by its nature, the way fabric works, they've woven threads together like that, right? And so once you cut the edge of that fabric, those threads can start to come undone. And as you wash them, take care of them, wear them, all that comes unraveled, and that can be a real problem. So let me show you actually in a costume here that is meant to look like it's old and worn. And it may actually have even been built out of an old quilt. But you can kind of see here how it's made up of a lot of different fabrics with different patterns and different threads in it. It's really quite detailed. Here, I'll put this thing on and then you can kind of see what the heck this is. I'll put it on over my jacket. It's a big coat that was used in a show, and the character actually was kind of a magical character, and I think it has some of that quality to it. So I'm sure that the costume crew would not be washing this real often, but that's okay, I think, because, it's a coat on the outside, so there'd be garments worn underneath. But in any event, it's meant to look kind of raveled, and I just wanted to show you what happens to the fabric if you don't do something to prevent all that fabric from coming apart. You can see here where actually they've hemmed and rolled it under so that it stays together, it doesn't come apart. But over here, the threads are starting to pull out as they are here. This will all come apart if you don't do something about that. So I'm going to take this off. I'm going to show you some of the ways that garments are treated so that you don't get that kind of raveling. You're basically finishing edges on the fabric. So before we get to garment construction, we'll talk about some of the things that are done to prevent that raveling. So perhaps one of the simplest ways of dealing with raveling fabric or preventing it would be to use something called pinking shears. And I don't know if these show up better here against the blue or here against the white. I hope you can see that they have a jagged edge, zigzag built into them. So these are called pinking shears. And if you take regular shears, and here's a piece of fabric, and you can see how when this fabric was cut, these edges are starting to unravel. Right? And so now to prevent that, I'm going to take some pinking shears and I'm just going to run right down the edge of the fabric here. Try not to remove very much of it. I don't know if you want to come around here and see it or if it reads pretty well from there, but here on our sewing show, you can see how that prevents now. I'm going to run my finger down here. That stops those long threads from coming off of the fabric, as you can kind of see in these other parts. Now, one of the problems with that, though, is that if you keep washing that garment, it will shred and come undone. So let's take a look at some clothes commercially made. These are not costumes. These are But costumes, again, pretty much follow the same kinds of approaches here. So here's a men's shirt, right? And what they've done is they have taken and rolled the fabric back under itself, you can see. And that's perhaps most obvious here on the bottom hem of it. They took the fabric and they rolled it and rolled it again and then sewed it down. So that's really what you see here. They've stitched it just like that. There are faster ways to do that because that involves ironing and stitching and getting all those edges finished. There are actually faster ways, and if you're wearing a t-shirt today, you guys, you're gonna pretty much have this next method, and that's a serger. And a serger takes the edge of the fabric and it takes the threads. It has several needles and a blade, and it cuts the fabric and it wraps the edge of the fabric like that. So then this can't unravel, you see? And they've done that down here. Rather than doing that rolled hem, they serged it and the machine put it all together. You can probably see that more clearly here, where they have contrasting threads against this darker fabric. That's all done with an overlock machine. And the book, I believe, says, or your notes from your reading, kind of connect the two terms are arguably interchangeable. Let's go over and take a look at a serger and a sewing machine. The reading talks quite a bit actually about a sewing machine, and I don't want to get too lost in that, how to operate it and run it and what have you. We can do a separate video on that at some point, but I just wanted to show you the main differences here. Both machines actually have pedals, so rather like your car, you've got a bit of a gas pedal here that allows it that gives the sewing machine its speed, and the same with the serger. Both machines have an on-off switch over on the side, so, and usually what that does, unless the bulb's burned out, that brings the light on, and then you know you're pretty much ready to sew. I don't know if you can get in here and kind of see all of this, but here's the needle with the thread, and basically what it has is a thread from below and a thread from above, and the machine takes those two and puts them together, and that gets you with your sewing. So let's just take a look at that. It has a pressure foot that holds it down, holds fabric down, and then these are little grooved teeth or dogs that pull the fabric for you. So when you're sewing on a machine, you don't actually have to push the fabric or pull it, you basically steer. So I put my fabric in here and I have a little lever on the back. Can you see my lever? That lifts that foot and lowers it, right? And I spin this back around so you can see, and then I've turned on my switch here, I can begin to sew, right? Now, one of the things that happens when I'm sewing is that I can pull these threads apart pretty easily. That's a problem. So what I've spent all that time sewing can come apart. So, see, I'm using that word a lot. So when I start, I'm going to stitch forward a little bit, and then if you see here on the machine, there's a reverse button. I can push that down, and on this machine you have to hold it. It's going to go back, and then I'm going to go forward again. That's that little bit of a back stitch. When we do our hand sewing, one of the stitches we'll do is a back stitch. But as you can see here, the contrast of the threads, what that's done is put extra stitches in there so that that can't pull out as easily when I am sewing garments together. I have some little snips here so I can cut my thread. Please, whenever you cut the thread on this or a serger, leave lots of extra thread there, because when the machine starts, it tends to pull the thread back on itself. So that's the basics of a sewing machine holding the fabric together. But let's go over here now to see what a serger does. So as we were just talking about previously, the fabric edges tend to unravel here. And so what the serger is going to do is cut away a little bit of the fabric, and it's also going to lock those threads in by using all 4 of these threads up here. Okay, so you have a lever where you can raise and lower the foot on the serger, but we don't need to do that in this instance because the machine has the dogs and it pretty much pulls it along. I hope you can see right here is an edge, a little metal edge, and that's really where the blade is. You pretty well gauge that on where it's going to cut. So I'm going to put my fabric here. I've turned it on already, and I know that because my light's on, and I'm pushing my pedal and off it goes. You see how it's cutting away there? And I'm going to turn sharply now and get out of this. So you see I would run that down to the end of it. And I'm going to let this, like the sewing machine over there, I'm going to leave extra thread on here when I cut it. But now I think you can see what that's doing to the edge of that fabric. And that is a serger or an overlock machine. I just wanted to tell you about some of the typical sewing tools, and so let's start again with scissors, just a little refresher. Normal fabric scissors, cut straight and true. And you really want to make sure you're keeping your fabric scissors sharp. Don't be cutting wire or mesh or aluminum foil. That would be a bad thing. We also have some little snips for cutting the ends of threads really quick. And again, we have these pinking shears, which allow us to cut the fabric to get these jaggedy edges so we don't get that unraveling. So one of the handiest tools is this seam ripper here. And basically what it does is it has a sharp tip that allows you to get around the threads, and then back inside here is a bit of a blade that cuts those threads. So let me show you an example of how this works. I can open up a seam that I have here. You can see the threads, and basically for me, I'm going to reach in here and I can see a thread, and I can get the little tip right underneath there. And then you see once I cut one thread, it begins to unravel. But rather than scissors, which are likely to cut the fabric, this nice sharp blade here, or with the tip, gets right in there with those threads. And I can zoom along with my seam ripper. And what do you think? Rip a seam wide open. Now down here where we had back stitched, it's going to take a little bit more to get in there. Well, there you go. So we've taken it apart with our seam ripper. Another handy device that is in your reading is a hem gauge, and the hem gauge basically is a short ruler, 6 inches long, with a little glide that allows you to pick a distance, and it will always show you that distance, which is real handy if you want to place buttons at the same distance from a piece of fabric, or if you were doing a hem and you always wanted to set it at the same distance. You can see how I can sort of slide along here, and as I iron or roll this hem, I always get that same distance with it. Works really well. Since we can't really come together to work on the sewing projects as a class, and in class what we would be doing if we were all here would be sewing on sewing machines and using those sergers and what have you. But an important part really is to know some of the hand stitches, and that's what I want to work on now. So what I need you to do is get a piece of fabric and a pencil and a ruler and some thread, and if you could, make it so that the thread color and the fabric are a nice contrast so we can see those stitches. And what I'd like you to do is a combination of photographs of your work, which you can email to me, but also I would like to see, if you could, with your phone ideally, take some video of you sewing so I know it's not your mom or your aunt or your dad or your little sister doing all the sewing for you. So let's take a look here at how I would propose you do this. I've got a nice contrasting thread and I've got a handkerchief that I found in my drawer. You could use an old t-shirt, or if you find a scrap piece of fabric, that'd be great. I'd prefer, though, if you found, again, something where the thread and the fabric have a nice contrast so that it's visible. And I'd also prefer it if there weren't a busy pattern in the fabric, because I want to see this thread and these stitches. So what you're going to do is take your piece of fabric here and you're going to open it up, if you please. And so this handkerchief's pretty big. I don't know that I'm going to need to stitch the entire distance across this handkerchief, but I will do a good chunk of it, say 3/4 or so of the length. And I'm going to take a ruler and a pencil, and I'm going to give myself a very light straight line down this piece of fabric. Can you see that okay there? And then I'd like some distance between, something like maybe 2 inches, anyway, 1.5 inches between those lines, and do another one. The line's not super dark, it's not about the line, but that helps keep the stitching straight. And I'm gonna actually just do these 2 lines here. I'll do a third just in case, so I don't have to fight with this too much. Okay, so I've drawn my lines, and now, if I can manage it, I'm going to show you how to thread the needle. So what I've done is to cut that thread with some nice sharp scissors. If you've got your thread splaying all over the place, you're never going to get it through the eye of the needle. So what I'm going to do is pass it through there. Ta-da! And then I can take a hold of it. You see how I've got that there? And then I'm going to pull myself out here, tug on this. Whoa, there it goes. I am going to get myself a good, I believe the book says, 12 to 16 inches. Our reading says. Doubled on itself. Yes, there you go. And so I have my 2 loose ends, and so I can line all this up. I'm going to put my 2 loose ends together. Hold on to that, and then I'm going to tug these threads all the way out so that I now have this nice and straight. Okay, and then, now this is a tricky part. Good luck tying a knot in it. The way I go about it, and there are many, many ways to do this, and I'll probably see if I can get Shirley, who sews an awfully lot, to show you how to go about it later on, because she has a good methodology. But what I do is I go around my index finger here, right, and I've made a knot, and then what I like to do is sort of pull on that. Nope, came out. Sorry. Round we go. We can edit this. There it is. And so it's left me a little knot there in the thread. Showing you on a video how to do some hand stitches with needle and thread is really a challenge because of the scale of it. So we've decided we're going to ramp this thing up a little bit. And what we have here is some yarn. And I made a needle, a big needle here. You probably can't even see it because it's a dark needle with me wearing dark clothes. But what I'm going to do is thread it. And like before, I pull through so that what I end up with here is the needle at one end and my two threads running all the way along there. It's just double back on itself. And then what I would do would be to put a knot in it. And again, there are a lot of different ways to go about doing that, but what you want is a big kind of a gob of thread down at the end. You got that extra little nubbin off there. But let's go over the running stitch, which is a good, fast, temporary, not terribly strong stitch. You could use such a stitch if you wanted to gather fabric. And what do I mean by gather? That would mean that you could take and put some fullness into the fabric by pulling that thread. Or if you were just holding some things together temporarily, that's where this running stitch comes in handy. But again, it's real fast, it's not very strong. Let's take a look at how we would start. So this is my line that I'm stitching down. How convenient to have these holes. Thank you. So it will come up, the knot of the thread pauses. We just go right back down. Pull that till it goes nice and tight. And then I come up again. And I go back down, always moving forward. Now when you're doing your piece of fabric, you may be able to take several of these at a time. I can't really do that with my piece of cardboard here with the holes in it, but basically I'm moving along, stitching, and this is a running stitch or a straight stitch, and again, it's real temporary. Ta-da! And I'll do that down the whole length of my fabric, okay? Here's for a basic running stitch. I have my needle and thread, and what I'm going to do is start down here on the right. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to go right to left. And what I'm doing is passing the needle along underneath. This distance that I'm going is about 1/4 of an inch. You could go 3/8 of an inch and that would be all right. And I'm sort of pushing the needle along straight down my line. Can you see how that's working? Like that. There we go. Right, why don't you come over my shoulder a little more here. Yep. And so then I'm done that several times, and then I'm going to pull my thread through and through and through till I hit that knot, and I'm going to tug on my threads till everything evens out now. Okay. And then I'm going to get my thread a little bit out of the way, and I'm going to move over that same amount. What is that, 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch? You guys can approximate that. And I'm going to stitch along, but you see I'm moving down my line there, right? And I've done several stitches again, and now I can pull this through. And if I keep tugging on it and get my threads nice and straight, I have the beginnings of a running stitch. And you see how my little knot over there is preventing this thread from pulling through. But that is a running stitch. I'll do it one more time. Okay. And if you have any questions about this, we can go over it in class when we're Zooming, or you can email me about it and I can get you answers and further assistance. But what I'd like you to do is a running stitch all the way down the length of your piece of fabric. So please do a running stitch at least 6-8 inches long. And then when you get to the end, let's imagine I've stitched along here. I want to show you how to finish, since you won't have a little knot there. I'm stitching here. I've come to the end of my piece, and what I'm going to do is catch a few threads down here near the end. And again, there are a lot of different ways to do this. I'm just going to show you one, my quick and easy and fast way to do it. And what I've done is I've caught just a few threads of the fabric, and you can see I've got a little bit of a circle here of the fabric, of the thread, excuse me, and I pass the needle through it. And then when I pull on this thread, it makes a little knot. It keeps tying down and down and down. And again, I'm going to pull on these two threads since they're kind of loose there. Tug on them and it seals up. And you see I've got a little bit of a knot there. I'm going to do it one more time just to really catch it. I'm not making a big gob because I don't want thread everywhere, but I'm trying to get through that same bunch with my needle one more time. Hopefully you can see that. And I come through. Oy, I got a lot of thread catching here. If your thread gets all tangly, just go back, tug on it with your fingers. Yeah. Right, I'm pulling that. And now I'm down to my little gob. You see how I've still got my little circle there. And I'm going to pass the needle through one more time and tug on it. And then I've got myself a nice little knot so this stitching is not going to pull out. I'm going to flip this over real quick and show you the back side. See, I got stitches there and I got my stitches there. Now I can take my scissors. I'll leave a little bit of thread hanging out there, and I finished that. So again, I'd like to see you doing a bit of that stitching in a video, and then I'd also like to have you photograph that when you're all done with the project. One of the things, again, about the running stitch is that it's pretty temporary. So if I cut off that little bit of a knot that's there in my thread, even though it's this scale, I can really pull that out very, very quickly. So that's the running stitch. I'm going to put a knot in here again. I go around my index finger and I pull back, and I get a big gob of thread there. Good. And now I'm going to do the back stitch, and it is a much stronger stitch because it's really going back on itself, and boy is it hard to pull out. It would be, if you don't have a sewing machine, it's a great way to really hold some fabric together. So let's see if I can show you on a bigger scale this back stitch. So I've taken my thread and my needle and I've tied a knot into it. And what I did was I went along and I made marks on my line that I'm going to stitch, and I'm right-handed, so I'm actually starting on the right side. But when I do my first stitch, I'm actually coming up from behind and I'm coming in from the end a little bit. You see how I'm over one? And I'm going to pull this needle through with the thread, right? And then I'm going back, and here's the back stitch part. I'm actually going in reverse, right? And now you can see what I've done there. But now I'm going to skip ahead one, and I'm going to come up. So I'm kind of doubling back on myself here. All right? Can you see what I've done? I've sort of skipped ahead from underneath, and now I'm going back through where I had stitched before. So there's the back stitch, and I pull that, right? And I'm going to come underneath again. Even though I went down here, I'm going to jump ahead, skip ahead a little bit here, and I come up from below, right? So let's take a look at what's happening in back. You see how these are now starting to be like double length, and then the top is a single stitch, right? So I push through again, and there it goes. Uses a lot of thread. You see how this looks so nice and clean up here, and then I have these nice long poles underneath, and boy is this a strong stitch. So I've come underneath, all right, and I'm up. You see that okay? And here it is again from below, and then I go back through. So that is the back stitch, and when you cut the end of that and try to pull this out, it's really hard because they've all locked together in there, and that's the back stitch. I think one of the things that maybe make this whole process easier, at least when you're starting off, is to draw your line on your fabric with your ruler, and then you can make marks every, I don't know, 3/8 or 1/4 inch. Please don't feel like you got to use a ruler to measure everything, but I just went along and made a few of these marks that are equidistant. It just makes the whole process easier. So when I begin this process, and I've got my needle and thread here, and I put my little knot into my thread, and again, it sort of doubled on itself, right? So what I'm going to do is start from below, and this is a little tricky, but I'm going to take my needle, and I'm going to poke around. I don't know if you can see this. I'm going to poke around until I find my second mark in. I'm not beginning at the very end as we did with the running stitch. I come in one, and I come up from the bottom, and I pull my needle out, and my thread's going through here. It stops there. Now I'm right-handed, so I'm going over here to my right, and I'm going through again. Ta-da. Yep. So I pulled that there, and now I'm going to go underneath the whole way over. I'm going to skip underneath and come up over here. So I started here, I went over here, and now I'm coming underneath, skipping a whole space. All right, I'm going to pull that up, and I will show you the back side now. Wait, I gotta get those threads in there. We want those nice and straight, so I'm gonna tug these all the way through. Oh, come on now. There we go. This thread tends to wrap up on itself. There we are. So I tugged on those threads. I don't know if you could see that from what's going on with this video, but I've got this, so I came all the way underneath, right? And now I'm going to go back, and here's the whole back stitch part. I'm going to go back in and go down right next to where that came up initially, my first stitch. And I come through again, and I pull that thread all the way around. Sorry, this is really hard to show on a video. So I have done that, and then I'm going to go underneath again, and I poke around. Nope, missed it. Nope, missed it. There it is. I came up from below, and I pull my thread all the way through, and we'll take a look at the bottom side again. Let me flip that over. You can see how I've run the whole distance again. The last stitch that I wanted to tell you about, and that you'll need to do for this project, is a hem stitch. Again, all these instructions are in the reading, but basically what a hem stitch is doing is taking the garment, which we're seeing here, and folding underneath and inside part of that garment. So it's raised up here, so you get a nice clean edge. And you do a stitch that runs between the edge of that fabric and catches just a little bit of the outside of the garment, and then comes back here and keeps hopping down this way. So we'll come back to that, but let me show you just a couple of examples. There are machine hems. In blue jeans these days, a lot of people just with the garments, the hem is visible, but you can see how they've rolled it underneath, so it's not gonna fray here. And the sewing machine rolled along and put that hem into the garment. But let me show you one that was done by hand here. Look at the outside of this pair of pants, and you'll see a thread that really very much matches the color of the garment. And then if I open it up a little bit here, now the edge wasn't finished, and this again is why you might use pinking shears or a serger or something to finish that, or roll that hem under. But what we have basically is a hand stitch that comes from underneath, comes up and catches just a little bit of that fabric on the outside, and then comes back through, and that ends up holding that garment's hem in place. So again, let's take a look at this on paper. This is our garment here, and this is the fabric that we're folding up. And so what you do is you would take your needle and you would come up from underneath here, from below, come up, come back down to the garment and catch just a few threads here, and then you come back up, and underneath from here you would bring your needle up and then come forward again, catch a few threads. You don't want a whole lot of threads showing on the outside of your garment, and then you just keep going, zooming along this way. So let me show you what happens. I have my handkerchief here. I have my thread here with my needle, and I put my knot in the end down here. But again, it's a big loop of thread like that. So to start, and I'm right-handed, so I'm going to begin over here on the right side. I presume if you were left-handed, you would start on the left side. And I'm coming up from underneath here. This is the part that I'm hemming down to the garment, and I pull that tight. Let me get the little gob out of there. So I got my knot there, and then what I'm going to do with this lined up, I'm going to just catch a very few of those threads of this fabric, the outside of the garment. You see how I've caught that? Yep. And then I'm going to pull this through. Right? So this part of the garment is now connected there, right? And then I'm going to move down the part of the garment that I'm hemming here, right? I've moved down a little bit, and I'm going to pull that through underneath, right? So you can see how that's beginning to connect there. Good. And then I'm going to catch just a few of these threads here, right, in that outside part of the garment, like that. And I'm going to pull that through. A lot of thread here, got to untangle it a little bit. There we go. And you see how I've caught, again, just a little bit of the garment on the outside. And then I'm going to scoot down, and I think you can probably jump a ½ inch or so. They don't have to be super close when you're hemming. You obviously don't want people to get caught in these bits of fabric when you're putting your garment on, so you can kind of see again how far I've gone. And then I'm going to catch a few threads on here. Just a few. And if you've got too many when you first pull through, back up with your needle and catch it again. Don't grab a big gob of it on the outside of that. When you're doing that, okay, pull that a little tight. It is hard with a fabric that's as light as this handkerchief is to do this very effectively, but I'll do one more, and then you can see how this works. And I'm jumping down a little bit here, coming up from below, right? Can you see where I am there? Right, and I'm pulling that through, so I've come through, and now where I am here, I'm lining up above, because I don't want to tug that fabric way over. And see how, again, I only caught a few of those threads there. And I can pull that through. But if you don't catch enough of that outer part of the garment, it's just going to rip out. So make sure you do catch enough threads. And remember, when you get to the end, to tie yourself off with a knot, what I'm going to do is come through just catching a few of those threads. And this is how I do it. A lot of people do it differently, but this is how I go about it. I've got myself just about a loop finished, and then I can pass my needle through the little bit of loop that's left there, and then I can pull it tight, get my threads all tugged in there, and I can pass, and I can do that twice to catch those little bits of thread there. And again, I do this to make a loop and a knot, and it tightens down, and then you can see how that's all done. I can cut that thread. So I've only done a little bit here so that you can see an example of what I'm doing with the hem stitch. And I've used a high contrast thread color. When you're doing this for real in the real world, you'd want to use a matching color, just as I showed you on that earlier garment there. But I would like you to do 6 to 8 inches of length here in that hem stitch, so you get the hang of it along the way. Tie it off at the beginning and the end there as a sample, and that's the hem stitch. Remember, please, on all these stitches, if you can, use your phone and get somebody to film you, or you can film yourself doing the hand stitch a little bit, but then also take some pictures and submit those pictures. Let's talk a little bit about how to sew a button on. As you can see, most any shirt, a lot of garments still use buttons. I wonder how far back historically they go. Well, they're great terms of holding stage garments together because they're so strong, and also they often do suggest a period and a time and a place. So what I'm going to do now is fire up my thread, and I've got a button and a piece of fabric. Let's take a look at how this is going to happen. So I've got my needle, and I've got my thread, and I've got my button. And I'm doing this on blue fabric here with a white button and a red thread, so you can see some of this contrast. But what I'm going to do is take my needle and come up from underneath the fabric here. This is a little hard to see, sorry, hard to manage. Come up from below through one of the holes in the button. And what that's doing by then pulling that through, that leaves, I'm going to flip this, that leaves the knot on the underside to start. And it shows me that I've brought that thread up through the button. Okay? So then what I'm going to do is pull this pretty tight. I'm going to hold the button and the fabric down, and I'm going to go back through the fabric right in the hole next to it there. You see that part where I'm starting going in there? And then I'm gonna pull this nice all the way through, yeah? And so I've pulled that tight. I'm gonna flip this again. I can see that I've got those there. And what I'm gonna do is come up from behind now. Boy, this is just hard to navigate for you here, sorry. And I'm gonna come back through again where I had started my initial hole there, and I'm going to come up and through, and I'm going to do this until there are 3 wraps around. I guess you could say loops. I should have done this a little closer to the edge of the fabric so we'd have an easier time of flipping this thing around so you can see what I'm doing. But I'm going to come up through one more time over here. And I keep poking around till I can come up and get this in there. Right? And I'm going to go back through one more time. So now I have 3 double passes there. You see, I got a lot of thread going in there, right? You can tell how often I've done that. So then I'm going to move over underneath. I'm poking around with my needle until I find that hole, right? And I pull this up now from below. And I'm going to go back down through that. Right? And now let's see what's on the underside. I got this gob of thread down there. So, okay, because nobody sees it. And up we go. And back through. So I'm doing it 3 times through both of these, right? Pulling it nice and snug. Right? And my last time through. So now I have done this here 3 times here and 3 times here, always working around from the back. I'm going to flip this over now so you can see I don't have too big a mess there, but what I'm going to do now is tie this off on the back, and I've made a knot there. And I'm going to pull my threads through that loop, which allows me to knot this. And then I'm going to do it one more time. So then it, whoops, it's very secure. I don't know, hopefully, can you see that there? Sorry, my fingers get in the way when you're looking at it. And then I go through my little loop one more time. And that knots it off. And then I can take scissors, cut that off. And let's look at this button right there, sewn down. And that's on there nice and strong. I'm going to show you because I'm going to tug on it. It's in there real good. So that's what you're doing with the button.